Good afternoon, everybody. Before starting the actual presentation, we wish to thank the organizers of this conference, Anacleto D'Agostino and Silvia Lischi in particular, for having invited us to discuss aspects of the first urban phenomenon in the Greater Indus Valley in such a prestigious context. Definitely a rare and precious occasion for those who are working beyond the eastern fringe of Western Asia. In fact, it is increasingly evident that the Indus civilization was deeply integrated into the networks of commercial and cultural interaction that linked all regions of Western and Central Asia, or in other words, the Greater Middle East during the third millennium BCE. This presentation attempts to coherently summarize the insight provided in four papers addressing formal links between different aspects of urban life in the Indus civilization and its social, economic, and political organization. The so-called Indus civilization, to be more appropriately described as the integration era of the Indus tradition, developed seamlessly from the local Neolithic through the selection, synthesis, and eventual crystallization of specific cultural traits from regional Chalcolithic cultures. From the mid-3rd millennium BCE, the Indus or Harappan culture spread over a vast and highly differentiated territory in the lower Indus and western lower Ganga basins, eventually including also western Rajasthan and northwestern Gujarat. In the first centuries of the second millennium, the Indus civilization began disaggregating as an integrated social, economic, and political system, and by the mid-second millennium, the region returned to be a mosaic of local cultures, each with specific traits in the material culture. This collapse was due to the co-occurrence of different cultural and ecologic factors, with a key role likely played by the modification of the major water flow system in the region following the sudden desiccation of the so-called Gagar-Hakra River that used to flow just east of the Indus. Hundreds of Indus sites are in fact located in what are now the Cholistan and Western Thar deserts, which are highly productive irrigated farmlands during the third millennium. In the third millennium, the greater Indus Valley was therefore capable of sustaining a large population, providing the necessary alimentary surplus to support urban centers with large sectors of the population devoted to non-primary productions and trade, and a constellation of medium-sized towns and small rural villages. In today's presentation, we will mainly focus on the two main cities of the Indus civilization, Mohenjo-daro in Sindh and Harappa in Punjab, which provide a more solid archaeological dataset for interpreting Indus urban life. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were part of an integrated system of large urban centers, often called regional capitals, the political organization of which still escapes a precise definition, located at the center of almost equivalently large territories occupied by a 4 or 5 tier hierarchical settlement system. However, this long-lasting model has to be apparently reconsidered after the recent discovery, about 80 kilometers northwest of Mohenjo-daro, of Mohenjo-daro, an urban center of almost comparable size. Let's now discuss Mohenjo-daro and the civil engineer of the Indus cities. Mohenjo-daro is traditionally divided into a rectangular citadel to the west, with the larger public and ritual buildings, and a trapezoidal lower town with the residential and productive areas, at its turn subdivided into several walled neighborhoods. The total extension of the site is highly debated. However, considering recent series of core drillings and other occasional finds after construction works in the area, Mohenjo-daro seems to have extended for several hundred hectares, perhaps not all settled at the same time. first consideration about Mohenjo-daro is that, quoting the late Michael Janssen, the city was built in the Indus, not on the Indus. Considering its proximity to the river, Mohenjo-daro was most likely heavily flooded in the summer months when the Indus flowed downstream with a front of several kilometers. It is likely for this reason that since the early 3rd millennium BCE, the Indus elites built massive platforms and retaining walls by means of enormous investments of collective work. In the case of Mohenjo-daro, the entire city was built on top of box-like artificial platforms lined with baked bricks, which were continuously raised up to reaching a height of about 15 meters for the lower town and more than 20 meters for the citadel. The artificial platforms of the citadel were articulated into a hierarchical system sustaining specific buildings and incorporating a complex network of water wells and drains. Unfortunately, the original excavations by John Marshall and Ernest Mackay in the 20s lacked a proper methodological approach, and we are left now with imaginative interpretation of rather unique buildings, including the so-called Buddhist or pseudo-stupa, for which is variously interpreted as a Buddhist period structure made reusing Indus-baked bricks or an original Indus building of unknown function. The so-called Great Bath, a large complex made of baked bricks which includes several small squarish rooms with separate water drainage pipes surrounding a large water tank accessible from two stairs at the opposite ends. The tank was made waterproof by a thick layer of bitumen. Although speculative, its interpretation as a building where rituals involving immersion in water were performed is quite likely. We owe Mortimer Wheeler the interpretation as a great public granary of a massive building composed of large quadrangular blocks of baked bricks supporting a wooden superstructure. This interpretation was based on tenuous comparison with Roman buildings in Britain and the fact that Wheeler was expecting to find large public storehouses on the citadel. The same approach was used in the interpretation of the so-called Pillared Hall and the Priest College, the actual function of which still escapes our understanding, although they were most likely part of large elite residences. Thanks to a comprehensive and detailed documentation and operational interpretation of the architectural remains by Aachen University in the 80s, we have more precise information about the lower town with particular reference to the so-called HR area. Area HR provided a good, although obviously very partial, testimony of the structural complexity and functional diversity of the buildings composing the lower town of Mohenjo-daro. At this point, we must note that still in 2002, summarizing our understanding of the Indus civilization, Gregory Possel stressed the absence of temples and monumental residences for kings and elites, thus proposing that the Indus ideology did not admit such expressions as they were promoted in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. In 2010, Massimo Vidale instead published a seminal paper describing a large palace in area HRB and a series of functionally related buildings, the coherent interpretation of which shed new light on the organization of Indus cities and in particular on the traditional dichotomy between citadels and lower towns. The so-called palace of HRB was a residence elite, and we do not intend to give the term palace any political implication, measuring 80 by 40 meters, including 130 rooms of different sizes and functions, articulated around a big open courtyard. Instead of standing in isolation to better display the socio-ritual prominence of its occupants, HRB Palace were part of a densely built network of smaller private dwellings, ritual buildings, and productive areas. The second anomalous building in HRB is the so-called House 23. Although this was never properly excavated and a conclusive interpretation was never provided by the original excavators, it seems evident to us that it was a pool built following the same exact model of the Great Bath on the Citadel, with the purpose of emulating, even on a smaller scale, the socio-ritual customs and the status of the inhabitants of the Citadel. The discovery of the little bath completely changed our understanding of Indus water symbolism and elite behavior. Now the Great Bath on the Citadel is not an isolated architectural case. Similar ritual pools may have been a distinguished trait of palatial life in all major cities of the Indus civilization. In the Citadel, the Great Bath is the most imposing building, possibly meant for public rituals and display, while the nearby elite residence, the so-called Priest College, look comparatively small with its about 80 rooms. In HRB, in contrast, the small baths appear relatively small compared to the much larger palace. The little bath of HRB may have been more private and secular than its prestigious ancestral model, like a private chapel or a parish church compared to the city's cathedral. Area HRA includes another singular building, the so-called House 1. According to the hierarchical analysis of room and passages carried out by Michael Janssen and his team on all buildings of HR, House 1 was definitely an exceptional complex, certainly not a domestic building. From the entrance, two stairs interconnected three buildings gravitating around a central open courtyard with remains of a round enclosure at its center. Contrary to the typical Indus water wells, which were brick-lined for their entire depth, this enclosure counts only a few brick courses, giving the perception of a more superficial structure. Comparisons with typical Indus iconographies depicting the worship of sacred trees could provide insights into the interpretation of House 1. There are in fact several examples of large acacia and pipal trees growing in circular enclosures. Although still conjectural, if considered in the general framework of Indus religious beliefs and architectural models, the interpretation of House 1 in HRA area as a sacred structure built around a holy tree is definitely not to be rejected. Another building in area HRA, House 8, helps us to understand a few more characteristics of Indus cities and their structural features and social economic organization. House 8 measures about 25 by 30 meters and had a 1.5 meters thick foundation walls in baked bricks with a 3 meters wide main entrance. John Marshall described House 8 as a 2 or 3-story upper-class residency that underwent several modifications over its lifetime. Some large rooms on the ground floor were divided into 2 or 3 smaller spaces, witnessing an increasing complexity in the activities performed inside the house and or in the number of its inhabitants. Unfortunately, we only have a few preserved walls of the first floor and evidence of a second floor or terrace made using wooden elements. House 8 is a notable example of the fact that at Mohenjo-daro and in the Indus cities more in general, the grids of streets and alleys remained unchanged for centuries, and the houses were rebuilt and raised on the same foundation, although with frequent changes in the inner layout. This conservative attitude was probably dictated by the tremendous amount of work that moving the many water wells and the complex centralized drainage network would have required. This last consideration leads us to another fundamental characteristic of the Indus cities, which is perfectly witnessed at Mohenjo-daro: the construction and maintenance of complex systems of water supply and sewage disposal. Fresh water was supplied by a network of wells, sunken cylindrical shafts several meters deep, built of wedge-shaped standardized baked bricks. The wastewater and sewage of almost every house were channeled into major drains running along the streets or collected into cesspools to be regularly emptied. Based on the evidence of the excavated areas, Michael Janssen estimated that Mohenjo-daro must have been serviced by at least 700 wells, including private and public facilities. In private houses, water wells, or in some cases large storage jars, are often related to the so-called bathing platforms, located either within a larger room or in a separate bathroom along the street side of the houses. They consisted of a slightly raised platform of baked bricks edged by a row of standing bricks to form a shallow basin. In many cases, they were sided by a small podium from which the batter below could be showered with buckets of water. The floor generally sloped toward a corner where the effluents flowed along a gutter or through an outlet in the wall to be discharged into the street drain or in a catchment vessel outside. A latrine, also connected to the main street drain, is often incorporated into the outside wall of the bathing platform. A unique civil engineering accomplishment of the Indus civilization is in fact the hierarchical network of effluent drains built of baked bricks along the streets of Mohenjo-daro and in many other Indus cities and towns. After having briefly discussed some of the most characteristic features of Indus urban centers in terms of building types and civil engineering using Mohenjo-daro as a reference, we move now to Harappa to discuss how Indus cities was settled, developed through time and space, and which social economic dynamics regulated these processes. You can immediately perceive from these two images that unfortunately the site of Harappa has a different monumentality compared to Mohenjo-daro. Most baked brick walls were in fact caved by the British Raj to build the track ballast of the 100-mile-long railway from Lahore to Multan around the middle of the 19th century. This unfortunate event, however, allowed the Pakistani and American archaeologists of the Harappa Archaeological Research Project to investigate the formation process of the city and its development throughout almost 2 millennia. On a broad scale, Harappa had an urban organization perfectly comparable to that of Mohenjo-daro and of most other large Indus cities, with a citadel mound to the west and a lower town to the east, the latter divided into a large insula, each with its system of artificial platform and independent city gates. The possibility of excavating the lower deposits under the massive platforms allowed the Pakistani-American team, directed by Mark Kenoyer, to reconstruct the evolution of the settlement in the different periods from the mid-4th to the mid-2nd millennium BCE. The earliest occupation was found in the northwestern corner of Mount AB, which would later become the citadel. A second area was soon occupied on the northwestern corner of Mount E, configuring Harappa as a polycentric settlement from this very foundation during the last centuries of the 4th millennium. Period 1 occupation produced accumulation of domestic debris that resulted in low mounds with no evidence of platforms or retaining walls. During the so-called Codigi or early Harappan phase, which in many aspects can be regarded as the formative phase of the Indus civilization, the original settled areas expanded to occupy the entire mounds A, B, and E. Massive mud brick revetment walls and platforms were built in this period to raise the settlement and regulate access to the separate walled areas. Most aspects of the material culture that will characterize the Indus civilization were introduced in prototypical forms in this period, including typical stamp seals, writing signs, and standardized units for length and weight. During period 3, which is the Indus civilization, the urban settlement of Harappa reached its maximum extension, with a spatial organization comparable to that described for Mohenjo-daro. The transition between the two periods was definitely gradual. The Indus phase of period 3 is distinguished by the construction of massive retaining walls of baked bricks directly above the earlier mud brick structures of the previous period. The brick size, building techniques, and orientation of the main walls are identical to those seen in period 2. At the beginning of this period, Harappa was already organized as a polycentric urban compound with a citadel on Mount AD to the west, which was the earliest settled area, and a large insula to the southeast on Mount E, each with their independent system of platforms, peripheral walls, and city gates. Unfortunately, we have scanty and discontinuous information for the area covered by the modern village, but small test trenches reveal that the entire area was settled during this period. Two peripheral mounds, mostly devoted to craft activities, Mount F and Mount ET, were now incorporated into the urban compound by enclosing them into separate walls with independent entrances. Data from Harappa allow us to propose a specific urban development model for the Indus civilization. In both Mount E and Mount AB, various categories of evidence point to the existence of at least three subperiods related to architectural building phases and alternate episodes of urban growth and decay. After the rapid urban expansion of period 2 and the general structural consolidation of period 3A, there is evidence of a phase of civic decay and despair on Mount E. Several buildings were abandoned, the street drains became clogged, and the wall and gateways became eroded and non-functional. The lack of civic maintenance on Mount E reflects a shift in social-economic control and political focus to Mount AB, where an extensive construction phase and site build-up are witnesses in this phase. The following period 3B is marked by a massive cleanup operation on Mount E with new drains, new southern wall and gateways and new houses. At the same time, structural decay is witnessed on Mount AB. Finally, during period 3C, there is evidence of extensive congestion in many areas of the site and a general lack of civic control, possibly reflecting an overpopulation of the city. These combined solid pieces of evidence suggest that Indus cities did not develop following a gradual, punctuated site expansion interrupted by periods of abandonment or contraction and final collapse. Instead, urban expansion in Indus civilization was apparently driven by different coexisting focuses of power, which built up their own neighborhoods and established new areas of the city in a fluctuating social, economic, and political equilibrium. Studies of archaeological intra-site variability at both Mohenjo-daro and Harappa had failed to provide any factual evidence of a hierarchy or sharp social gradient between citadels and lower towns. Judging by the finds, this separate urban district could hardly be distinguished in terms of differential circulation, display, and consumption of wealth. New and more comprehensive information demonstrates that each walled compound was conceived and constructed as a citadel on its own. We should abandon the traditional view of citadels as being opposed to lower towns and think instead of a cluster of citadels, or better, wall compounds separately rising around ancestral fortified seats of power. The walled compounds constructed after and around the main citadel were inhabited by new elite groups competing for status recognition with their predecessors. The inhabitants were wealthy families and groups of followers that struggled to emulate the prestigious, long-established custom of the older citadel, and this competition may have persisted for centuries. Massive baked brick platforms, complex gates, composite pillars, and ritual baths were part of the same symbolic behavior developed in the extended palace-like complexes where Indus elites lived and ruled for centuries, based on such a pervasive ideological model that impacted the creation of the Indus urban world. In summary, urban development in the Indus civilization was based on a shifting balance involving urban environment maintenance, architectural investments, and objectified power among the various walled compounds. This model can be linked to a heterarchical frame of social economic and political power, a form of political organization that, allowing for the alternation in power of different groups of families or even fluctuating elite social aggregation, may have prevented the establishment of a single king-based dynastic monopoly. In other, much later historical contexts, heterarchical societies were the expression of economic systems in which uncertain, long-distance trade patterns allow rapid successes and falls of unstable, temporary corporative organizations. How far this social economic phenomenon was linked to the extraordinary investment in long-distance, cross-cultural trade by the Indus society remains entirely to be investigated, and it could be the subject of a future presentation. To conclude, we would like to humbly dedicate this presentation to the memory of the late Michael Jansen, who devoted most of his life to preserve and understand Mohenjo-daro. Thank you very much for your kind attention.